Thank you very much, too, for that nice introduction. I'll tell you the way that I like to introduce myself to people. I like to say that I'm an earth scientist because of my background in meteorology. I'm a computer scientist because I also have a degree in computer science. And I'm a Christian scientist. I'm a lifelong student of the science of Christianity. So what can I say? I love science. What I love about science is how it asks us to look beyond what we can see. It seeks order from seeming chaos. It pushes the limits of what's possible. It emphasizes what we can do instead of what we cannot do. I really did love my career in the earth sciences, but long before I was a meteorologist or an engineer, a software developer, a manager, I was an 11-year-old girl who was scared of thunderstorms. I love to tell this story because I think all of us have something in our lives that we feel is bigger than we are. And I'd love to share with you how I prayed about this fear of severe weather. My family was living in Kentucky, and we were just getting ready to move to the state of Oklahoma. About 2 weeks before we moved, I saw sitting on the coffee table in our living room a magazine with a picture of a tornado on the cover, and across the top, a single-word headline, Oklahoma. Yeah, this caught my attention. I picked up the magazine, I read the article, and it said, among other things, that Oklahoma is in the heart of what's known as Tornado Alley, a region of the Central Plains of the United States that has the highest frequency of tornadoes. This made me more than a little apprehensive. And unbeknownst to me, 2 weeks later when we moved, it was right at the height of tornado season in early June. For the first 2 or 3 weeks we lived there, we had severe weather of one kind or another almost every night. I was terrified. I literally thought that we had moved to the most dangerous place on earth. Over the coming years, I spent many hours hiding in my closet with my dog under one arm, my radio under the other, just cowering in fear, waiting for the storms to be over. But as scared as I was, I could see that my parents were completely unafraid. And I knew their fearlessness came from their trust in God. I wanted more than anything, to feel that freedom from fear that they felt. They talked to me about how they prayed about things. For example, we talked about stories in the Bible, like the story of Elijah, when God tells him to go stand on the mount before the Lord. And the Bible says that a great and strong wind rent the mountains and break in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Bible commentaries I've read agree that in this experience, Elijah was learning about the nature of God as not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but in the still small voice. I was also familiar with passages from the book of Psalms, like this one. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. And this one, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And I was familiar with stories in the New Testament about Jesus stilling the storm, about Paul and all of his shipmates being saved from the shipwreck at sea in the violent storm, all because of their trust in God. I knew I couldn't just will myself not to be afraid. I mean, let's face it, I was trying that, and it wasn't working. I knew this had to be a spiritual victory. So I began a spiritual journey that lasted many years. And there were important milestones along the way. Little by little, I was coming to understand more about God as love. Not just that God is a loving God, which He is, but that God is love itself. As it says in the book of 1 John in the New Testament, God is love. I was coming to understand more and more that this God that is love does not send destruction. He cares for His children. He loves us. He nurtures us. He's life-giving, life-sustaining. And I was coming to trust more and more in the ever-presence and the omnipotence of this love that is God. Now, somewhere along the way in my spiritual journey, I decided to major in meteorology in college. Some people might call that ironic. Some people might say that I was just trying to understand my nemesis. I can honestly say that that was not my motive. But even if it had been, without my realizing it, I can also honestly say that it wouldn't have worked. Because the more I found out through my study of meteorology, the more I realized how much we still don't know about storm formation, path, life cycle. If anything, my study of meteorology was making me more apprehensive, not less. But I was continuing to gain in my study of Christian Science. And my spiritual journey culminated in a broadcast I made at the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Oklahoma City. As you heard, I was working as a NOAA weather radio announcer. We were having a lot of severe weather across the state on this particular day, and as is typical in a situation like that, I was doing a lot of live broadcasting. So at one point, I went over to the printer and I ripped the copy off and I took it over to the microphone and I started reading on the air cold. And this is what I read. A tornado has been spotted 2 miles southwest of the Oklahoma City airport, moving to the northeast at 25 miles per hour. I was at the airport. I realized while I was reading this copy for the public that I was reading a tornado warning for my exact location. And I wasn't in a storm cellar or a bunker. I was in a little building exposed out in the middle of the airport grounds with no basement. But I also realized something wonderful. I was completely unafraid. For the first time since I was 11 years old, in the face of severe weather, I was completely unafraid. I knew I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to be doing, and that right activity was blessed. It was blessed of my Father. And it was keeping me safe. Nothing could keep me from this right activity, not even a tornado. The tornado dissipated, and the storm passed, and I realized something else wonderful. I knew right then I would never have to be afraid of the weather again. And I haven't been. I've been in situations just that serious, but I finally learned that God is not in the wind. or the earthquake or the fire, but in the still small voice of love. And the still small voice of love is where true power really lies. Now, over the years, I have pondered the fact that my study of physical science didn't help me overcome the fear of severe weather, but my study of Christian science did, and it's caused me to think even more deeply about this science of Christianity. So I'd like to share with you today some of the things that have occurred to me over the years. First of all, I hope that nobody here is confusing Christian science with Scientology. That's a common misconception. The two are very different. Unlike Scientology, Christian science is based entirely on the Bible, on both the Hebrew scriptures as well as the New Testament. This is the King James Version that I have here. Science is the study of something. Christian science is the study of the Christ, the study of the life and teachings of Christ Jesus. I've also always thought that Christian science fits the definition of science given in Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. Let me read part of that definition. Science is a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through use of the scientific method. So, general truths, the operation of general laws. Earth science studies laws thought to be governing the earth in order to understand and apply those laws for the benefit of humanity. Computer science studies laws governing computers, the laws of circuitry and logic, in order to understand and apply those laws for the benefit of humanity. Christian science studies the laws of God, divine laws, in order to understand and apply those spiritual laws for the benefit of humanity. Now, this point explains both the similarity and the difference between physical science and Christian science. Both are interested in law and the application of law, but physical science draws its conclusions based on the evidence of material sense, while Christian science draws its conclusions based on the evidence of spiritual sense. By spiritual sense, I mean the capacity to understand God. All of us have spiritual sense. All of us have this capacity to understand God and our relationship to God. Spiritual sense is entirely outside of physicality, but it is entirely practical. It doesn't ignore human needs. Rather, spiritual sense addresses those needs from a perspective outside of physical sense. I'll talk more about this as we go along. For now, back to that definition of science. It talked about something called the scientific method. I'm guessing the scientific method is something that all of you have at least heard of at some point. I think the scientific method of research is currently being taught in the first few years of formal education in the United States. But for those of you who might not have been in elementary school for a while, let me just remind you of the 6 steps of the scientific method. Step 1, ask a question. Step 2, do some research. 3, form a hypothesis. 4, test the hypothesis through experimentation. 5, analyze the results. And 6, publish the results. I once read a first-hand account of somebody who had a conversation with Isaac Newton, in which Newton told him what he thought when he saw the apple fall from the tree that led to his discovery of the law of gravity. Apparently, that really happened. Isaac Newton was sitting in a grove of apple trees when he saw an apple fall to the ground, and here's what he said. He thought, "Why should that apple always descend perpendicularly to the ground? Why should it not go sideways or upwards, but constantly to the earth's center? Assuredly, the reason is that the earth draws it." So he went on to describe what he was seeing in mathematical terms, and then he tested his equations by looking at the motions of the planets in the solar system. And once he felt that his math was accurately describing what he was observing, then he published the law of gravity for all the world to use. That's an example of the scientific method. Well, I have always thought of the discovery of Christian Science as having followed the scientific method. So I'd like to take a few minutes now and talk about how the discoverer of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, applied the scientific method in her discovery. Who remembers the first step in the scientific method? Yes, ask a question. Very good. The question Mary Baker Eddy asked was, where is true healing found? She grew up in the early 1800s in a family of Congregationalists. They loved God and they loved the Bible. In her family, they read it every day. As you heard, she was rather frail and sickly as a child, and this condition continued well into her adulthood. But rather than this turning her away from God, she sought even more earnestly to understand God's role in healing. And she did this while investigating various methods of treatment, which took her to the second step in the scientific method, doing some research. She investigated not only conventional medical treatment, but also other forms of treatment available at that time, like homeopathy, hydropathy or water therapy, mesmerism. And she did find some measure of help through each of these different methods of treatment. But she didn't find permanent cure. And she was also left wondering about all of those stories she loved in the Bible in which people were healed through prayer alone. All during her research, Mrs. Eddy remained a devoted student of the Bible. She really took to heart Jesus' words, "He that believes on me, the works that I do, shall he do also." And it was her deep desire to understand those words that propelled her forward. Now, during this time, Mrs. Eddy not only received homeopathic treatments, but she also administered them. And she later called one of the cases that came to her a falling apple on her road to discovery, making reference to Newton's experience. This was a case of a woman who had been diagnosed with dropsy, or an abnormal retention of fluid. Mrs. Eddy, at some point, realized that she had prescribed for this patient the same medication that the previous homeopath had prescribed. She started to become concerned that a prolonged use of this particular drug would have an adverse effect on the patient. But the patient, feeling that she was being helped by the drug, refused to give it up. Well, out of concern for her patient, Mrs. Eddy decided to try giving this woman unmedicated doses. And she watched her very carefully, of course. She didn't want there to be an adverse effect for another reason. But the woman continued to improve. After a while, this patient said she would try giving up the drug. But on the third day, she relapsed, said she couldn't get along without it. So Mrs. Eddy started giving her the unmedicated doses again, and the woman started to improve again, and ultimately she completely recovered under this regimen. This case proved to Mrs. Eddy that it was not the drug, but the woman's faith in the drug that had cured her. There was also another case of healing that Mrs. Eddy later called a falling apple, and this one led her to the next step in the scientific method, forming a hypothesis. This was her own healing in 1866. You heard a little bit about this already this morning. Mrs. Eddy was walking on the icy streets of Lynn, Massachusetts when she slipped and fell. And it must have been a serious fall. As you heard, a local newspaper reported that she was taken up in an insensible condition to a nearby home. The next day, she was moved to her own home and pronounced in critical condition. And after several days of being treated by a physician with no improvement, she was diagnosed as having suffered severe internal injuries. As you heard, in her extremity, Mrs. Eddy asked for her Bible. And while she was reading an account of Jesus healing someone, she gained a deep insight into the nature and reality of being. Remember page 108 of Science and Health. She was so uplifted that she got up, she got dressed, she walked into the next room where her friends were astonished to see her recovered. She later wrote that she was ever after in better health than she'd had before. The days of her being an invalid or a semi-invalid were over. As Isaac Newton had pondered that falling apple, Mary Baker Eddy pondered what had happened to her. And as he had done, she formed a hypothesis. Hers was based not on human conjecture, but on what she called divine revelation. And it was this: that spiritual healing of sickness and sin, as Christ Jesus practiced it, is based on universal divine laws that can be learned and applied today. Here's what she wrote about that experience. This is on page 109 of Science and Health. I knew the principle of all harmonious mind action to be God, and that cures were produced in primitive Christian healing by wholly uplifting faith. But I must know the science of this healing. So she continued her research, focusing intensely on the Bible. She was convinced of the truth she'd glimpsed, but she knew she needed to understand it better so that she could explain it clearly to others. She also knew that she shouldn't publish her theories and her deductions until she had thoroughly proven them. So as Mrs. Eddy moved to the next step in the scientific method, she submitted her discovery of the rules of Christian healing to what she called the broadest practical tests. There are many, many healings documented throughout this period of Mary Baker Eddy's life. I'll just share a few of them with you here. And these were not just minor ailments, but they ran the full range of physical difficulty and disease. For example, there was a man who wrote to Mrs. Eddy that a large timber had crushed the bones of his foot. He asked her for a prayer treatment. Mrs. Eddy gave him one, and the man reported that he was restored at once. He said, "That very day, I put on my boot and walked several miles." In another case, Mrs. Eddy's prayers cured an entire family very quickly. The father was healed of rheumatism, the son was healed of a disease of the bowels, and the daughter was healed of deafness. Her case had been given up as incurable. In later years, Mrs. Eddy was asked about this particular family and how those healings were accomplished. She replied, "It is love that heals, only love." And of course, by this, she meant the love that is God. She knew that healing wasn't personal, but it is God that is the healer. Then there was a case of a man who had been diagnosed with enteritis and bowel stoppage. When the medical community felt that there was nothing more they could do for him, someone sent for Mrs. Eddy. Her prayers cured him that day. This particular case was reported in a Boston newspaper, and it was called a remarkable case because the man had not only had this wonderful physical healing, but he had also undergone a complete character transformation. His wife said the thing she was most grateful for was his radical change morally and spiritually. As Mrs. Eddy moved to the next step in the scientific method, analyzing the results of her work, she realized, as this last case illustrated, that people were not only being healed physically, but they were being renewed morally and spiritually. She came to see that Christian healing must be accompanied by a renewed sense of oneself, because the true healing is mental. And this is consistent with stories in the Bible in which people's names were sometimes even changed to denote their change in character. For example, Jacob was renamed Israel. Simon became Peter. Saul was renamed Paul. She also found that people were healed most readily when they entrusted themselves wholeheartedly to her treatments. Conventional medical treatment begins from the premise that there is a broken physical body that has to be fixed. Christian Science treatment begins from the premise that God's children, created spiritually, are already perfect. And our task is to understand this more clearly. You can see that these are two opposing points of view, and these differing perspectives do not agree on approaches of treatment. Mrs. Eddy found that those were healed most readily who were not divided between these two perspectives. At this point, Mrs. Eddy was having consistent success in her own healing practice. Early on in her research, she reasoned that if indeed her work was based on universal laws, that she ought to be able to teach these laws to others, and then they ought to be able to repeat her healing work. So she began taking students. Some students were more successful than others over the years, as is the case in any scientific endeavor. But there was consistent progress in the growth of Christian Science, and in the number of cases healed as a result of its practice. So after 9 years of research and practical application, Mary Baker Eddy felt that she had proved the truth of her hypothesis, that spiritual healing of sickness and sin, as Christ Jesus practiced it, is based on universal divine laws that can be learned and applied today. So she published her results in this book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. She taught hundreds of students, always wanting to more and more share from her heart the truth of this science she had discovered. Ultimately, she formed a board of education offering classes in learning about the science of Christianity. And she edited Science and Health hundreds of times, looking for better, clearer ways to explain her discovery to the masses. There is a place in Science and Health in which Mary Baker Eddy gives what we might call the spiritual sense of the scientific method in 3 steps: divine revelation, reason, and demonstration. I'll take just a minute and talk about each of those. Revelation. You may be interested to know that Mrs. Eddy included proof as an aspect of revelation. She never felt that she could reconcile any spiritual concept that had come to her through divine revelation unless she could validate it through practical application. This concept of revelation is not a huge leap for me as a physical scientist. Remember I said one of the things I love about science is how it asks us to look beyond what we can see. Newton looked beyond the falling apple. Scientists using the Hubble Space Telescope looked beyond darkness. They trained the telescope on a dark region of the sky, a region where nothing appeared to be, hypothesizing that there actually was something there if they could just look deeply enough into space. And sure enough, thousands of never-before-seen stars and galaxies became evident. Christian Science teaches that a deeper look into the realm of infinite divine love reveals the nature of God and His love for His creation. And this deeper look into the spiritual cosmos is made evident through transformed lives, including physical healing. The second of this three-step summary of the scientific method is reason. All scientists reason through things logically. Computer science is all about logic and reasoning. Isaac Newton reasoned that the phenomenon of the falling apple could be explained through universal laws. Mary Baker Eddy reasoned that the phenomenon of Christian healing could be explained through universal laws. It does require logic and reasoning in order to apply these laws for healing, and I'll explain more in just a minute about how I've done that. But first, the third of this three-step summary of the scientific method is demonstration, proof. All scientists require proof, and I'm no different. As you heard, I don't study Christian Science because somebody told me I had to. The interesting question for me is not how I started studying Christian Science, having grown up in it, but the interesting question is why I stay with it. And I stay with it because I've seen it work. I see its relevance and its effectiveness in my life. Or in scientific speak, I have my own evidence that supports what Christian Science claims to be. For example, one time, a woman whom I'd never met called me and asked me if I would pray for her in my capacity as a Christian Science practitioner. A practitioner is somebody who is devoted full-time to helping others through prayer. She was having this physical problem. It had never been diagnosed by a doctor, but it involved swelling and pain, respiratory problems, difficulty walking. And she and her husband were quite concerned for her health. I told her I'd be happy to pray with her about this. And I began by affirming her safety in divine love, much as I had learned when I was praying about the weather. I also knew that Jesus said God is spirit. As you heard earlier today, the offspring of spirit is like spirit, has the substance of spirit, is spiritual. So in other words, I affirmed that this woman's true identity was spiritual, not material, that her true body was the body of her thought. I also knew that the Bible talks about God as life, the source of all existence. And because this woman could never be separated from God, she could never be separated from life. So we prayed together for a few days, and then a couple of other things came out that we needed to address. One was that she was in an unhappy job situation. The other one was that she was in charge of a family property, and this property needed extensive and immediate repairs, but there just didn't seem to be a way to bring those about. One day, this woman called me just in tears, feeling overwhelmed by all of these things. And in that moment, I just really reached out to God to know what I could say to her to bring comfort, to help her, to bring healing. And as I just listened with my spiritual ear, I felt divinely guided to ask her a simple question. I asked her, "Are you feeling a lack of love?" And later she told me that she was a little surprised by that question, and I confess I was a little surprised myself. But she said as she thought about it and prayed about it, she realized that she'd always thought of her parents and her grandparents as sort of a safety net, as a security blanket. And now that they weren't with her anymore, she was feeling as if she didn't have a safety net. Yeah, she was feeling kind of out there on her own, separated from love and from security. So this dear woman and I reasoned through this in Christian Science. We went right back to the law that God is love. We affirmed that God is her true father and mother. And because she could never be separated from God, she could never truly be separated from parental guidance in a very real sense. And of course, she could never be separated from that all-embracing, ever-present, divine love that meets every human need. So we just continued to pray together over the coming weeks. And then one day she called and she said, "You know, I feel just wonderful. I can confidently say our work is done." And it was. I saw her 6 or 7 years later. The physical healing was permanent. And those issues with the job and with the property, those began to turn around right away as we started to pray together. And they had continued harmoniously ever since. Now, this is just one example of hundreds and hundreds of examples in my life in which I have turned to God in prayer and found healing. And for me, that is compelling evidence. Now, it's true that in the practice of Christian healing, there are no thermometers or wind gauges or blood pressure measurements. But Christian scientists do gauge thought. Jesus said to the man at the pool of Bethesda, "Will you be made whole?" I've always thought he was asking the man to measure where his thought was. Are you willing to be made whole? Often when Jesus healed someone physically, he would say something to them like, "Go and sin no more," or "Be not afraid." First and foremost, he was addressing thought. Now, the connection between thought and physical healing cannot be measured physically. That's what people are always trying to do, trying to devise some sort of medical test in order to validate prayer. I contend that it can't be done because prayer and its effect can be discerned only through spiritual sense, or what we might call the Christ Spirit. Of course, the person who best understood spiritual sense was Christ Jesus, the master Christian. He said, "As I hear, I judge." He told the disciples, "Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear." He was talking about spiritually. Jesus is the perfect example for us because he taught that this Christ spirit with which he was imbued, which motivated all of his healing and teaching, the same Christ spirit is eternal. It's here today. One time when Jesus was deep in prayer, praying for his ministry, for his disciples, he said, "Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also which shall believe on me through their word." That includes all of us. Paul wrote about this to the Corinthians. He said, "Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. But God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God." The Spirit that Paul is talking about here is the Christ Spirit. The Christ is what enabled me to overcome the fear of severe weather, to help my friend feel loved and safe. If this seems a little esoteric, you might think about it this way. We don't see wind or friction or gravity, but we see and feel the effects from these things. The love of a child is real and tangible, but you can't measure that physically. Or think about music for a minute. Say that you have two musicians, two pianists, and they both sit down at the same piano at different times and play the same piece of music. Maybe they both get all the notes right, all the rhythm correct, technically perfect. One of those performances may leave you feeling cold, unmoved, while the other performance may absolutely uplift and transport you. Now, the difference in those performances is not the notes on the page or the piano. It's the inspiration of the musician. You can't measure that physically, but you know when it's there and when it's not. Again, what I love about science is how it asks us to look beyond what we can see. Science and health includes a definition of the biblical word prophet. Let me just read that definition. A prophet is a spiritual seer. Disappearance of material sense before the conscious facts of spiritual truth. This definition reveals that every prayer in Christian Science is a kind of prophecy. It's exchanging a material view of things for the conscious facts of spiritual truth. And therefore, every healing in Christian Science is the fulfillment of prophecy. It's looking into the heart of divinity, into God's infinite law of infinite good, and being a witness for the unfolding of that good. Let me just give you one more brief example which further illustrates this idea of seeing spiritually. At one point in my life, I was in a relationship with a man, and we were having a disagreement about something. And the disagreement was serious enough that it threatened the entire relationship. You can imagine that I was pretty upset about this. And at one point during this period, I was awakened in the middle of the night with a stabbing pain in my side. It was rather alarming. I tossed and I turned for a while, and finally I got up and I opened a book on my bedside table. This was a book written by Mary Baker Eddy about Christian Science called Unity of Good. I opened this book at random, and my eyes fell on a sentence at the top of one page, which said, "A lie has only one chance of successful deception: to be accounted true." When I read that sentence, I had a brilliant flash of spiritual illumination. The best way that I've thought to describe that experience is to say that I glimpsed absolute truth. What became so clear to me in that moment is that God's universe is the only universe there is. It is entirely spiritual, and it is entirely harmonious, without any bitterness or hatred or discord of any kind. I could see so clearly that in this one only completely harmonious universe, disagreement was literally impossible. And the suggestion that I could be having a disagreement with this man had to be a lie. It just simply could not be true. It was crystal clear to me. At once, the pain was gone. It was so sudden that it startled me, physically and mentally. It was a jolt. My concept of who I was and my place in the universe, who this man was and his place in the universe, changed in an instant. And this healed me physically, instantaneously. That moment of divine consciousness, that moment of spiritual clarity, that glimpse of absolute truth, stands out as a beacon to me in my life. And I cannot ignore it. I confess I've wanted to more than once. Sometimes it can just seem easier to believe in life in the flesh instead of life in spirit. But that moment of spiritual consciousness is evidence that is more real to me as a scientist than anything else I have ever experienced. And I might add that the relationship was completely healed. In fact, I've been married to that man now for many years. There is one more main point that I'd like to make before I wrap it up. If I'm having trouble applying the teachings of Christian Science, or I'm not getting the results I'm looking for, I don't abandon the science, but I might question the application. It's like math. Just because sometimes I had trouble working problems in calculus or using imaginary numbers, and yes, there is such a thing as imaginary numbers in math, I didn't dismiss the whole of mathematics as foolish. Rather, I realized that there were other principles of math I'd been able to prove, and there were others who'd been able to work these problems. And I knew if I could just understand the principles that lay behind these problems better, that I too would be able to work the problems at hand. So similarly, in Christian Science, these glimpses of absolute truth, along with a body of other evidence I've gleaned over the years through healing, through my study and application of Christian Science, and all of the thousands and thousands of healings I know about by others who have practiced Christian Science over the last 150 years. All of these things tell me that there must be something to this science. and it makes me want to learn more. You know, astronomers are always trying to learn more about the universe by looking farther and farther out into space. And they do that because the farther out you look in space, the farther back in time you see. The farther out you look in space, the farther back in time you're looking. Now that is a cool and mind-bending concept. Those galaxies that were discovered by the Hubble Space Telescope are thought to be among the oldest in the universe, 12 to 13 billion years old. And we were able to see those because the Hubble telescope can look so far into space. But the measurement of time and space, even vast amounts of time and vast amounts of space, is still a finite proposition. Whereas looking at the universe through the lens of Christian Science reveals infinity and eternity. And for me, that is the coolest concept of all. The discovery of Christian Science introduced a whole new way of looking at the universe, which makes other theories obsolete. That's why my study of meteorology didn't help me overcome the fear of severe weather, but my study of Christian Science did. It gave me a whole new way of looking at what I was measuring as cause and effect. And by the way, I have been asked if one has to have a background in science in order to study Christian Science. Of course, the answer is emphatically no. Christian Science is for everyone, regardless of your profession or your background. Mary Baker Eddy wrote, "Regardless of what another may say or think on the subject of Christian Science, I speak from experience." And she did speak from experience, decades of experience of applying universal divine laws to benefit humanity. And I also speak from decades of experience that support what Christian Science teaches. Let me leave you with this thought. One of the things I have always loved about Christian Science from the time I was a little girl is that Mary Baker Eddy never asked us to take what she said at face value. She told her students to follow her only so far as she followed Christ. She said everything she taught was based on her understanding of the Bible. She wrote, "You can prove for yourself, dear reader, the science of healing, and so ascertain if the author has given you the correct interpretation of Scripture. Proving it for yourself is what any good scientist would do." Thank you very much.